Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully that was loud enough. Okay, this is the first session of the afternoon. It's 90 minutes. We have 4 speakers. They'll each do their presentations, and then we'll have about a 20-minute Q&A with everybody lined up here on stage. My name's Jay Whetter. My primary job is Canola Digest editor. I'm also involved quite heavily with Canola Watch, which is the agronomy email newsletter. If you don't get it, just go to canolawatch.org and sign up. And then I'm a communications manager with the Canola Council of Canada. And I'm chairing this session. It's called Challenges to Productivity and Profitability. Like I said, 4 sessions, 90 minutes. The first speaker is Ian Epp, who's my colleague with the Canola Council of Canada. Ian's an agronomy specialist, and he's going to present on unlocking the genetic yield potential of canola. Ian.
Oh, good. The timer almost said I had 4 minutes, and I was like, this is already a little much to put into 10 minutes, so I will get rolling. I gave this presentation last week in half an hour, so I've tried to distill it down to 10 minutes. I will go through quickly, but I don't want to go through too quickly, but if you have questions, I've definitely had to leave out some slides or some of the context, so feel free to come out and reach out to me after, and I can maybe fill in some of the gaps or kind of some of the rationale of how we've come to this. I get to work for the Canola Council of Canada as an agronomy specialist. Often I'm asked what an agronomy specialist does. We do some agronomy. We also get to lead steering committees and kind of bring different parts of industry together. I think that's some of the value we do. We facilitate some of that. So taking research needs up to researchers and then bringing them back. We have different areas of expertise. And so every day gets to be a little bit different. The more I do this, the less, I think, traditional agronomy I get to do. I spend quite a bit of time working on market access, working with the PMRA, or dealing with making sure that products that are registered for growers, you guys actually get to use and deliver your grain. When I don't do that, I take my best management practices and I turn them on the farm when I farm on my evenings and weekends. And you find out as a grower that what works good on paper and works good in a lab and it works good when I give a talk is sometimes harder to implement. So I'm going to keep that in mind, and we try to balance those things that logistics matter when we're talking to growers, areas matter, each farm is very different. So when I present numbers, I'm talking average numbers because that's what's available to us, but every farm is a little different, every field is a little different. So when I talk about yield robbers or setting yield expectations, I want you to somewhat glaze over the actual numbers I presented and think about on my farm or the growers I work with, the fields I work with, what's a good yield target, what's our limiting factor, and every field, every farm is always different, and every year. All right, so a little bit of where I'm going to try to cover in 10 minutes, where we've been, the yield robbers, where we are kind of currently, and then where we're going. Average yields, we've seen this, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. We have ups and downs, and the key is to determine what are some of those ups and downs. The weather obviously is the elephant in the room. The weather sets maybe the outside parameters of what we can grow in a year. Some years, maybe on average, we can get really high yields, some years not. Again, think about this, every farm, every region, these average numbers don't always meet that necessarily that much. We have really big droughts. We also have innovation coming along all the way on this slide. Just a jumping off point again, every field is different. Think about your field, your farmers. If we look at from some grower survey work we did, this is just Alberta, looking at some of the ranges in yields. We get average yields, we talk about average numbers, but we see growers that are having 25 bushel canola, and we see growers that are regularly breaking well over 60. When anytime we've talked about our Canola Council, our long goal of 52, I have growers saying, well, I've been doing that for 10 years, this is not that new. And I have growers saying, I don't think I can ever reach 52 on my farm. And that's fine, the goal is just those are averages. But on your farm, this is why I really liked Aaron's presentation this morning on the yield enhancement project, looking at, given the deck you're dealt, what that field is, how close am I to the percentage, using that water, using the soil conditions, the hand I'm dealt, how close am I to achieving that maximum? That's really far more interesting than the top yielding one, because again, every field is different, every farm is different. And we see some changes there with growers maybe applying fertility, the exact same fertility across the whole farm, to maybe some slow moving to adjusting it field by field. And maybe the next step of that is zone by zone. Again, dilating in for the specifics of those fields in a way to tease out every little bit of yield we can find in a profitable manner. 2024, we saw lots of this kind of talk yesterday. Again, weather is really important. That sets the error bars for what kind of yields we're going to grow in a given year. That sets the stage for what kind of pests we're going to deal with. So the weather is there. That's a huge component of why our yields are what they are in a given year. But there's a lot of management that goes into that. So, genetics is really important. Then there's the environment, and then the management and that interplay. That's where we have a lot of value. That's where, as growers, as researchers, as industry, we have a lot of opportunity to maybe make the really tough years maybe not as bad, and really capitalize on it when there are really good growing conditions. Again, the weather is very important. We know that canola doesn't like plus 30, especially when it's flowering. Cool nights, if it's really hot at night, the canola doesn't reset, that's tough. You can do a lot of things right agronomically, and the weather can be really tough. Cooler, and so there's been a number of studies that have looked at this. You can correlate weather conditions, especially during flowering. You can look at, the amount of rain, you can correlate that. And again, that explains a lot of why the yields in Western Canada go up and down, and why maybe the last couple of years have been a little tougher. But there's a huge component of that that's not explained by the weather, that's outside of that. In industry, we see that where fields are different, farms are different, and that's some of that is the management. So that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my time. So looking at this graph, the yellow slide is the average yields in Western Canada, as I had in the previous one. And then looking at some of our tools for increasing yields, some of the management things, I did some work in Excel, or back of the math kind of projections on where we really capitalize on good agronomy. And so the green line is if we do maybe above average agronomy. Again, not every field's different. Every farm approaches agronomy differently. You see that some years there's a big difference between the yellow line and the green line. In those wetter years, there's a heck of a lot of opportunity, whether that's adjusting your fertility rate for good moisture, really capitalizing and nailing your sclerotinia, because that's going to take your really high yield and turn it back into, it's easy to lose 10 or 15 bushels to the acre on a really good year to sclerotinia. Some years, maybe 2021 be the most recent drought, good agronomy maybe got you hints, but not a lot, right? You still do need the amount of rain. You still do need those the environment has to cooperate somewhat. Maybe there's a little bit of upside there because even though it was super dry, you managed to get enough plants per square foot. And then looking to the things we can manage. These are yield robbers. We track these throughout the years. These are very much averages. I'd like you to think in your region, on your farm, what are your biggest yield robbers? Step one, I think, of doing a better job of managing this is identifying what your yield robbers are. I think I have a fairly small farm, and we have different fields have completely different yield robbers, different stressors, and every year happens to be a little bit different. Again, some of those are important, but step one is identifying what yield robbers do you see. That's probably the low-hanging fruit if we're going to make an agronomic change. The one thing I will address is just blackleg. We saw in the presentation yesterday that blackleg was the single biggest, we had probably the worst blackleg year we've had since we've had blackleg resistance genes. I highlight that for two reasons. One, it's very timely, and two, we have a lot of tools here. We have a lot of opportunities. Some of these things are harder to manage, but blackleg is one where we have a number of tools, a number of things. So if blackleg is a big yield robber, and 90+% of fields had significant blackleg in this last year, it wasn't uncommon for the northwest part of Saskatchewan to see growers that were losing 5 to 7 bushels to blackleg. That was not atypical this year, and that's a significant thing where growers have a lot of control. We have the tools, and again, picking which ones, it really matters up at how you want to manage it, but there's a lot of options available to growers. The other thing to talk about when we're setting yield targeting is that cost is exceptionally important, right? We know the costs have gone up, and costs have gone up in all crops, but maybe they've gone up a little bit more in canola. So as we're yield targeting, it's the agronomy, it's the environment we're working with. How do we maximize that environment? But it has to be profitable to the grower. If it's not profitable to the grower, it's just a non-starter. So how do we do that to behind efficiency? Again, costs have gone up in a few different ways, but again, the trend is costs are going up. So as we have higher costs, managing that risk is critical. I just want to highlight, it's a bit of an older study, but I highlight that if you talk in times like this, you got to look at what's your limiting factor. So if you have the numbers are a little bit old, but all your inputs, but then you did all your fertility, but you didn't do that second herbicide pass, and you lost some bushels from yield, or you didn't do this or that. Looking at sometimes just cutting costs where we are, you maybe have to look at that as a full package. Anytime we had some excellent talks this morning on fertility, and you have to remember that fertility is exceptionally important. And maybe it's the biggest difference we can make, but it has to go in hand with good weed management. It has to go with good everything else. If you do all the things right and you miss that one step, you might have had the yield potential for a really good crop, and suddenly you lost 10 bushels right at the end, or 6 bushels went out the back of the combine, right when you had it there and you were almost into the bin. So again, we have to look at this whole comprehensive agronomic package. Again, another slide that the numbers don't matter. I want you to think about this as thinking about what your yield robber is on your farm. So if you look at the WCC, RCC trials, your canola can push up to 130 bushels an acre. You don't see that in the field, but again, the genetic capacity is there. It increases at about 1% per year is the average. So the genetics are getting slightly better. The question is, again, weather. So pick that year for weather. I think this year I could grow a 55 bushel crop. That's what I think the weather has. Going back to that yen program, that's what makes me excited about that, is saying, okay, that's the theoretical maximum. And then the rest of these is just your yield robbers. How are we managing this? If you have that and you've soil tested, fertility becomes more or less a math problem, figuring out that, again, with the profitability built in. So maybe you didn't quite fertilize for 55, and then 90% of your fields in Western Canada, they don't have 4 plants per square foot in parts of the field. So in some parts of the fields, we're not realizing that fertility because we didn't have enough plants. Maybe your average plant stand is good, but we know there's huge variability in that plant stand. You know, maybe you miss a herbicide pass, or you have some sort of kochia patch that got away from you. Again, you're losing bushels. And this is where it's pretty easy to go from a 50 or 55 bushel crop to our average yield of somewhere in that 39. Again, every field's different, and those buckets are going to change dramatically field to field. But identifying which one of those are what's causing your big yield robbers, again, big step moving forward. So to break this out just a different way, again, the environment sets the stage for us. We're not going to reach the genetic potential, but maybe on your farm there is a 5 or a 10 or a 15 bushel an acre opportunity for management. And we see wildly different practices in Western Canada on management. Some of them work in a given year, some of them are what we did last year, some of them are successful sometimes, and sometimes we have some train wrecks. Ooh. There we go. So if you look high level at what are the biggest things we can do, just the biggest ones across Western Canada, nutrients, we heard that all morning. We have to get our nutrients right. Picking the right seed trait for your field, whether that's your black leg rotation, your club root, again, which one of these things is costing you yield? Lining up your traits, that plant stand. We haven't talked a whole lot about plant stands, but getting that right. If you don't have enough plants, everything else is really hard to manage. It's hard to fix that throughout the season. You got a really low plant stand, that means maybe you need an extra herbicide pass. Maybe your timing for everything else is kind of, you know, again, these things kind of cascade throughout the growing season. Identifying those top yield robbers, and then, again, getting them all into the bin. That G by E by M, that management opportunity. You know, taking whatever the environment's giving us, adapting to it, and then managing it and kind of mitigating the role of the environment. So I have a whole pile of list of future research opportunities or ideas there. The list is long, the opportunities are big. It's just a matter of, again, pulling these all together. A lot of excellent research happens and it looks at just fertility or just this. And again, pulling all of that together into a comprehensive package is what allows us to really capitalize on the environment. Oh, close to 10 minutes. Thank you.
I just had a quick conference with Ian to see if he could share those slides, because that was basically on 1.5x speed. So there's a ton packed in there. So EPPI at canolacouncil.org, EPI for Ian. Okay. Our next speaker is Dan Heaney. Dan is a senior consultant at Random Cross Consulting, and he's doing a presentation entitled BMP Adoption by Canola Growers, a Case Study Approach. Yeah, that's all I need to say. There you go, Dan. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Before I get started, I should acknowledge my partner in crime, Rob Gamble. Rob's an economist out of Ontario, and we've been involved in a couple of studies sponsored by Canola Council and Fertilizer Canada over the last few years, looking at some of the interaction between BMP costs and nitrous oxide reduction as it relates to fertilizer nitrogen use. And I guess I better figure this thing out. So today I'm going to talk about some nitrogen fertilizer, the relation a bit to nitrous oxide emissions, reduction targets that were set by the federal government for our BMPs and economics. I'm a soil scientist by training. Rob did the heavy lifting on the economics. I kind of handled a little bit more of the agronomic side and the nitrous oxide estimates. So I'm going to touch on 3 studies this afternoon. The first one was done actually by MNP. It was a major crop reduction, major rate reduction. It dealt with macroeconomics. The second one was a regional macroeconomic study that we did in 2022. And then the last one that I'll kind of hone in on is this case study farms for our BMP adoption. But there's a bit of a narrative here, and if some of you will remember, about 4 years ago, 2020, just before Christmas, Environment and Climate Change Canada came out with a 30% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions from nitrogen fertilizer by 2030, and they were using the 2020 as the baseline. And this was pretty much driven by what they saw through their greenhouse gas and climate lens as a rather alarming increase in nitrogen fertilizer use from about 2000 through to 2019, 2020. And as we heard this morning, part of the blame for that is on Warren. So this caused a number of problems. First of all, how did they come up with this 30% target? And as agronomists who've been working in the nitrous oxide scientists, we know that we could achieve 30% reductions with the use of BMPs that, source rate time place BMPs. But one of the issues was how much was that going to cost and who was going to pay the freight. One of the other problems was that the measuring tool that the federal government uses to calculate nitrous oxide emissions is the National Inventory Report. And in 2020 and in 2024, it is based on the nitrogen rate. It doesn't account for any of these other practices you can use that will slow the nitrification rate, as we saw this morning, slow down the nitrous oxide, help prevent denitrification, those kinds of things. So it doesn't really account for what I'd call those source, time, place side of the practice. So anyways, the NIR wasn't a very good tool. It looked very much like this was going to be a rate reduction strategy rather than a 4R nitrogen management type strategy. And eventually, when they did get the 2020 baseline out, this is what it looks like. Oops, wrong. Need to go here. This is what it looks like, that we have nitrous oxide emission. This just kind of puts the problem in some numbers around the problem. You can see that the main problem is nitrogen applications to annual crops. If you look at the map on the right, there's the various hot spots in eastern Canada, climate-driven, warmer, moister soils, and a little bit of higher nitrogen rates on crops like corn. In the west, we're more extensive. The nitrous oxide emissions that come off a kilogram of fertilizer, a pound of fertilizer in the west are lower, but they are still substantive because of the large area in annual crops. So think then, we get into 2021, we've got this issue where, is this a rate reduction strategy? The federal policymakers aren't giving us a lot of clarity on that particular issue right then. And so Fertilizer Canada pushed through a bit of a quick study on what a rate reduction strategy would look like in terms of the Canadian economy. So we have some numbers here where MNP did this study, and they did it for 3 major crops: canola, spring wheat, and corn. And I'm showing the canola data here. They based it on a 20% reduction in fertilizer nitrogen from the 2020 baseline. And they predicted that by the time we got out to 2030, this would result in about a 20 bushel yield gap. So now, why 20% nitrogen rate reduction? If you were kind of paying attention internationally at that time, the Europeans had come up with a strategy for their nitrous oxide reduction from fertilizer that was based on a straight 20% reduction in nitrogen rate. And so we were more than a little concerned, I think, in that the federal government at that time, and still to some extent, looks to Europe for leadership on a lot of these greenhouse gas issues, that they would follow the same route. So this was, what would be the impact of a rate reduction strategy on the Canadian farm economy for annual, crop production. And so out to 2030, this is just the canola data I'm showing. Well, Mike, can you come up? Okay, good, sorry. This is the canola data I'm showing. And it was going to be a net somewhere between a $5 and a $10 billion hit cumulatively out to 2030 on canola growers. So then the next thing we wanted to take a look at was if we kind of switched gears away from rate reduction and started to look at what kind of we could do with BMP adoption in terms of getting the nitrous oxide rate down. So we developed a regional model for 5 regions of Canada, Quebec, Ontario, and then the West we divided into 3 different regions, basically Manitoba, the black and gray soil zones of Saskatchewan and Alberta, and then the brown and dark brown, the drier regions of the prairies. And so what we did now is we started to integrate into this model, we started to integrate basically the nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol that was developed in Alberta. Now, it was developed and sort of brought to fruition in Alberta, but it's actually quite usable as across Canada because it's actually derived from the National Inventory Report. But it has a methodology in it to start to put some what we would call reduction modifiers on these rates and start to look at what the effect might be of BMP adoption. So what we did is we used mainly the fertilizer use survey to start to set some baseline, where was BMP adoption and for various practices, and then we kind of drove it up fairly aggressively over the out to 2030. So you can see the adoption rates we used here, including the different practices we modeled out, and you can see these are fairly aggressive adoption rates. You can if like double inhibitors, if we went from 8 to 48% in about 7-8 years, that would be pretty aggressive adoption. So aggressive, but what we thought could be done to get to this 30, to get some emission reductions. And so we integrated the economics of the region for the major crops in the region, and we built in some nitrous oxide, as I say, some nitrous oxide reduction into this model. And this is what we started to see, and this is the what we call Wet Prairie West. So this is basically where we are sitting right now, Saskatoon, the area. So, but all the different regions look pretty much the same. So we ran this model. First, we ran it without any yield increases in it, and then we ran it with yield increases. So the data here is without yield increases. And I want you to pay attention to that red line, because that red line shows what happened with the contribution margin. And so this is integrated across the major crops in the region, and you can see that without a yield increase built in, there is pretty steady downward pressure on the contribution margin on farms. And so this covers a lot of there's a lot of assumptions, of course, in this kind of model. and I'm not going to go through them all. But one of the main drivers was that orange bar and that red line or orangish line attached to that red bar, or orange bar, I should say. And that was there's this relentless upward pressure, and we saw a little bit of that. For example, in Ian, I think, touched on that. There's this relentless upward pressure on production costs. And it's been going up, when Rob really dug into this has been going up at above the rate of inflation for quite some time. So, this isn't some phenomena that kicked in, post-COVID. It's been there as kind of a trend for quite a while. So then what we did is we did a little bit of, we put some yield increase, and what we did was we took about half the distance for each region between what the yields had been averaged out of the last 5 years at our starting point in 2022, and we took into account some of the changes that had happened in fertilizer prices and crop prices in 2022, and then when we were doing the modeling. But we built in some yield increase. We added a little bit of extra N to deal with that yield, or to help push that yield. And then we applied our reduction modifiers and our rate reductions that I showed you earlier to it. So we kind of bumped it up, toned it down, and then calculated it out. And this is what it looked like then, same area, same crops. And you can see the trend is, we're still losing margin over out to 2030 with these BMP adoptions, and but it's less painful. And every farm is different. One of the reasons we didn't get into net income is because once you get below the sort of the gross margin or the contribution margin line, things get tricky with land prices and all that kind of stuff. But, I thought that was me beeping. Gee, I thought, no, I've got, yeah. Okay, so when we kind of sum that up for the country now, we're at the country level. What we found is this 30% target, which was about 3.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Without yield, we could get close to half of it, okay, about 14 million tons out to 2030. This is 2.5 million tons per year. If we increased yield, we dropped down to below, well below half of it, about 45%. So it's really about 65% versus 45% with some yield increases. The cost per ton of CO2e removed, or nitrous oxide removed, because we're adding some extra N, and that the cost, and the costs were pretty equal except for the N difference. The cost, fewer tons of carbon dioxide removed, so the cost went up somewhat. But then the contribution margin down at the end there, what we see is, this is cumulative what it was going to cost the farmers of Canada in the areas we looked at combined. They were going to, in 2030, they were going to be down an average of 109 million a year, as opposed to with some yield increase. And this, this includes all the crops that we looked at across the country. The farm economy, or the crop-based economy, the farm gate was going to be up about 4.2 billion a year. So I don't think there was a whole lot, we could quibble about, what our assumptions were in that, but I think there's, the trends were pretty clear, is that hitting that 30% target was going to take some, without some yield increase in there. One, we're not going to hit that 30% target, but without some yield increase in there, just trying to reduce nitrogen rates and keep sacrifice the economics was going to be pretty hard on the farm economy. So then the next thing we wanted to do is take a look, bring this, these were macro studies. We wanted to bring this down at the farm. So we took that model and we kind of made it farm specific. At this time, the OFCAF program, On-Farm Climate Action Fund program, had come out. Canola was quite involved in it. They had their canola program, and so we took some of the BMPs that were being used under OFCAF or supplemented under OFCAF, and we worked through them. And so, there they are with the, we did some N rate reduction, which we thought was pretty reasonable given, some experience we'd had with, what growers were willing to risk. And then we worked in some of this nitrous oxide reduction from the nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the main thing here is, we applied these BMPs to different crops, different cropping sequences with different amounts of canola in them, and in different parts of the prairies. And what I want to draw your attention to is that right-hand column, which shows this is the emission rate per unit of nitrogen applied. So this is this kind of gives you an idea of how the different regions were likely going to behave in terms of for every pound of nitrogen, unless you moderated it with some BMPs, what was going to come out of the soil in terms of kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So I'm going to focus in on contribution margin again on these, and let me just catch my notes up here so I can, So this is the different BMPs and the change in contribution margin. And this is without any compensating yield or N rate reduction. So we didn't do anything to try and offset the cost of implementing the BMP in this first scenario. And what it gives you a bit of an idea of is what's the real cost of those BMPs. And you can see, what I really want you to focus on is how they split out, that some are considerably more expensive than others. And so, especially the ones like split application using a urease inhibitor, where you're applying a urease inhibitor with your in-season. I mean, that starts to get, upwards of that $25 to $30 an acre. And some of the other ones were a little less expensive. The only one we found that was, cost positive was the switch from fall to spring. And I should maybe make a point on that one is we were looking at going from fall anhydrous to spring anhydrous. We priced it out with a conversion kit on the drills so that we assumed the drill could be converted to, to have a nitrous oxide, ammonium kit on it. And then we bought the farm in question. We bought them an extra ammonia tank. So, but it was the only one that came out positive in terms of the savings were greater than the costs. So then we thought it'd be kind of fun is let's put this in terms of what would you have to do to compensate those costs in terms of extra yield or reducing your nitrogen rate. And so you can see the data here as we go across that. Of course, not surprisingly, the more expensive BMPs were you had to get either a higher yield or reduce the nitrogen rate. These are independent ways to pay for it. But we're starting to look now at things like, for example, you have to get up around 1.5 bushels of canola yield. I'm showing the canola data here, or a little bit more to compensate. And that might be doable in some of the moisture black zones, but it might be a lot harder to get there if you're trying to grow canola in the brown soil zone. And then the same with the nitrogen rates. For some of those more expensive BMPs, you'd be looking at, to pay for that BMP, you'd have to get enough improved nitrogen use efficiency, without yield loss to, in the range of some of those in 30 pounds of nitrogen, which, at the time we did this, I thought, that's pretty much beyond what growers are supposed to are willing to risk. So I'm getting close to the end here. So then we looked, we just kind of broke out those rate reductions that I'd shown earlier, right? More modest ones in the 5 to 10% range, which in my experience, having worked with some of these protocols in the past, particularly in the US, that seemed to be where growers were comfortable with. They would reduce nitrogen by 5 to 10% based on how they thought BMPs would perform. But, when we did that, then what we started to see was, in terms of dollars per acre, the costs were compensated somewhat, but they weren't, at those kind of nitrogen rate reductions, we couldn't actually compensate for the price of the BMP. So then we added some yield increases in, and we used the same kind of philosophy where we increased yield, we put a little bit more nitrogen in, then we applied those nitrogen rate reductions, and then we calculated the economics, and then we attached the nitrous oxide emissions to it. And so what we started to see then was that we started to compensate for, and this is again the canola, we started to compensate for the cost of the BMPs fairly reasonably. We thought that growers would be able to implement the BMP, the added yield would pay for the BMP and perhaps a little bit besides. So finally, then, what was going on with the nitrous oxide? Well, this was all going on. And, what we found there was, and I just want you to, we did get fairly substantial nitrous oxide reductions using that sort of national inventory approach. But what I wanted to, it's a bit busy here, but you can see, three scenarios there. If you look at the rate reduction and the yield increase, what I wanted to point out here is that the differences start to break out between rate reduction and yield increase in terms of with the rate reduction, because the N rate's coming down more, you saw more substantial reductions in nitrous oxide. But the real message here is how different it is based on where the farm was and the kinds of baseline nitrous oxide emissions you would expect to get, or what the emission factors were in each of those district regions. And finally, then we kind of costed out the cost per ton. And I think if you look here, you can see that some of these, like enhanced efficiency fertilizer, has pretty reasonable costs per ton of CO2e or nitrous oxide reduced, whereas some of these practices were not that effective at reducing nitrous oxide emissions, and at the same time, they really drove up in terms of the cost of putting the BMP in place and the lesser amount of nitrous oxide they reduced. They really drove the price of the BMP up, and some of them, for example, on some of these farms were just like you got neither a nitrogen rate reduction, I should say a nitrous oxide reduction under the yield increase, or and the dollars per ton were basically uncalculable. And again, the only one that seemed to work really well was the fall to spring. So I'm down to the red light. So just a couple of points then. Nitrous oxide implementation costs. How are those costs going to be compensated for? I don't think that the federal government really thought that piece through when they came up with this 30% rate reduction. There's several ways you can do that. You can do that with increased yield. You can do it with decreased nitrogen rate. You can do some combination of that, which I think probably makes some sense. But I think there's still a pretty good chance that the farmers are going to be shortchanged on that. And so I think the other thing that needs to come into this is putting a value on nitrous oxide reduction and starting to use some of those tools, whether they are, tax incentives, as in, better development of the carbon market. It was a great disappointment to, I think, some of my colleagues and me that they never went ahead with putting the NERP program into that Canadian greenhouse gas offset program. And so I think there's, there's a lot of options there that haven't been tapped into. And then finally, and I see Jay's got ready to come give me the hook, I don't think we're going to hit 30%. I don't think we're going to even be close by 2030. It's not realistic. If these things paid for themselves, growers would have done them long ago because they've been around for a few years. So with that, I'll wrap it up.
Alrighty. Next, I'd like to call up Phillip Harder. He's the Research Director and Hydrological Scientist for Croptimistic Technology. And Phillip will be talking about understanding and managing ag-water interactions in canola production. Phillip.
All right, good afternoon. Yeah, so I think, we've talked a lot about nitrogen use and emissions, and I thought we could probably talk a little bit about water, because we've kind of been skirting the issue to some extent, because when it comes to production in the prairies, it is a water story a lot of the time, whether it's too much or too little. So this is kind of a high level from some of my work. So I guess to introduce myself a bit more, up until a year ago, I was at the U of S. I did a lot of work with sort of agrohydrology, trying to understand the water balance implications of crop production and agricultural management practices in this region. But since then, I've switched over to private industry, so now I get to have two hats on. And yeah, we'll talk about some spatial variability at the end of all of this. So there we go. When it comes to water and agriculture on the prairies, as a hydrologist by training, the way I kind of think about it is it all comes down to our water balance. And so there's a lot of discussion around like, oh, we can't change the weather, or we're dealt with the hand that we have, or, there's only so many things we can do, especially when we're in not an irrigated situation. And so when we're looking at the landscape, we often are very limited in what we actually see. So in the prairies, there's a lot of different dynamics going on. So this is on sort of a one-dimensional water balance. We have, precipitation comes in, and in the summertime, we've got evapotranspiration, so evaporation from our soils, transpiration from our crops that is occurring that's removing that water. We can, for a particular point in your field, you've got runoff coming in and out. You can have subsurface flow in and out, and then you've got groundwater interactions. When it comes to productivity, a lot of these things don't measure, but when it comes to productivity, the one thing that matters is transpiration. So we need to remove barriers to a plant using water through transpiration. So there's many reasons that doesn't happen. But the other addition of the prairies is that we have winter. And this is the problem where a lot of our agrohydrology understandings can fall apart when we're looking at, say, other regions where we don't have the same kind of intensity of winter processes. So, depending on the year, you can have 8 calendar months in a row where you've got snow on the ground, for example. That has huge implications. So winter processes primarily, we've got precipitation, we form a snowpack, we can have sublimation from our snow back to the atmosphere, we can have snow blowing into and out of our landscape, and ultimately there will be some snowmelt infiltration or runoff, and we've got this fun little component here of, do we have surface water saturation, for example, that changes all the other pathways even more. So it's a complex story, and people can get a little bit disillusioned by it, I think. But when it comes down to it, we need to understand all of these processes fundamentally to understand how we can change transpiration. So there's a lot of different factors involved. So I'll throw another use efficiency into this, which is water use efficiency. So this is some work that I did a couple of years ago. And so what we were doing was like, let's actually look at what is the water use efficiency of our various crops. There's a lot of discussion, do we have differences in water use efficiency with different varieties, environmental conditions, and so there's a lot of data out there, but none of it is actually really well presented at times, or it represents very much a particular situation. So the approach that we had taken was, well, let's look at a field scale water use efficiency. So the tool we had been using for this is eddy covariance. So instead of looking at soil moisture from a soil profile and looking at precipitation as our crop water use, we looked at how much is actually evapotranspiring from a footprint, an area that captures the spatial variability of a field. And so ignore all the circles that have a cross through it. We'll just pretend those don't exist for this presentation, and just look at the solid circles. And so obviously there's some really big differences between crops in terms of the water use efficiency. Barley, we're looking at about 2-ish bushels per acre per inch of water. Wheat, we're a little bit higher in this scenario. Canola, we're a bit lower down here, below 2. Our lentils are a bit higher, and then peas, in this example, were the highest water use efficiency. Before anyone criticizes me, this is a very small sample size. But what it does allow us to do is look at relatively what is happening in these different years and relative environmental conditions. And one thing that I'll point out to you very quickly is that within crop water use efficiency variability is relatively small versus what's happening between crops. So for example, barley, there's actually 5 points plotted all on that same one there. And the one that's right below, well, we had a really bad drought in 2021. So things get weird in very extreme situations. But when we look at this, the take home I'd suggest is that our water use efficiency is a whole lot less variable than we sometimes may think. And what that means is that if we want to, say, increase our productivity, crop water use efficiency, it's yield divided by crop water use. If our ratio doesn't change very much, how do we get more production? Well, we just need to increase the amount of transpiration. So how do we do that? That's a big question. So another thing we wanted to do is let's look at our water balance and see where is water coming from to grow our crops. So often there's the statement that is made is that rain makes grain. I'm not going to argue with you too much on that one, but to say, well, water makes grain. It doesn't really matter which form it comes in. So if you break apart some of this work, this is a site, this is near Keniston, about an hour's drive south of Saskatoon. This is near Keniston. And this is near Clavette at the Livestock and Forage Center for Excellence. We had some sites out there. And this is the same field. We had the same setup in each field throughout these intervals. So 2015, we started Keniston. That dropped up in 2020 because, logistics got weird that year. And then the data set that we've analyzed goes up to 2023 for this other one. What this is showing us is how much water is used by a crop. So this is what we're measuring with our flux towers. And red is evapotranspiration, sort of at a field scale. And then blue is the precipitation that occurred in the growing season. And there's a lot of different dynamics, and it varies by crop type, by year, and all that kind of stuff. But what I'll quickly point out is that except for 2015 and 2016, which are basically within the error bars, they're the same. We can't really differentiate to say that we had more rainfall than crop water use. But generally, otherwise, crop water use far exceeds in-season rainfall. So clearly, we're getting more water coming from different parts of the year in a prairie dryland ag system. 2017, for example, we had about 67 millimeters of water that came in as rainfall during that growing season, yet our crop used more than 200 millimeters of water. So what really it highlights is that we need to understand where that water is coming from. We need to know sort of these multi-year legacies, the context of what we're seeing in that particular field in that particular time. So 2015, 2016, we should also add 2014, were incredibly wet in these areas. So we had a buildup of moisture that basically persisted and got actually a fairly good crop in 2017, even though we had no real we had no reason to have that crop if all we did was look at the rainfall. So where is that water coming from? So we kind of expanded the analysis. This is about as complicated as a figure I'm going to show you today. And what it's breaking apart is basically these lines in the middle that are the same as the previous figure. This is our growing season water use and precipitation. But we also looked at other parts of the year. So how is our water in versus out change in our late fall, our winter, early spring, before seeding, during the growing season, and then thereafter after harvest and before the next water year. And the last line and figure is sort of our water year averages, or totals. So if we look back at our Keniston site here, we're seeing that we clearly had more water coming in than was being used through crop evapotranspiration, sublimation losses, runoff, whatnot. So we had, this accumulation of water, and then we got to 2017 and we clearly had a water deficit that year, but we had that buildup that carried on. 2018, it was actually also a fairly low water year, but we had pretty good crop production. But in that example, you can probably not see it, but we had all this extra water that came from our wintertime processes. So long story short on this, we need to understand our productivity in our particular year. We need to understand our multi-year soil moisture legacies and what's happening not just in the growing season rainfall, which is what we often can focus on, but a lot more about what our snow conditions are, how those are interacting, and how our different frozen soil infiltration processes are playing out, for example. So it's a complex story, but we have tools to manage these things. So, how can we address some of these uncertainties, some of these risks when it comes to water? Probably the most effective tool that can be put to use is snow management with stubble. So what stubble does is if you leave taller standing stubble in the field, you increase the aerodynamic roughness. It basically will trap your snow where it is. That's what you see. But what you don't see is the implications it has on sublimation. When snow is blowing through a field, you're losing a lot of snow back straight to the atmosphere. And so there's a lot of different ways of looking about it. It's hard to measure. And these things will vary very much by where you are in the prairies. But you can see on the order of, this is early work, but let's say comparing a fallow field. This is old work, so let's just call it lentil stubble. We had 103 millimeters of snowfall. We actually would have about 27% of that sublimate away, 13% blow away, and we would end up with 60% of our snowfall in that field at the end of the season. If you looked at a stubble field in that same area, you still lost snow, still lost water, but you're only losing 32% and you remain with your 68%. But Prince Albert, we're getting further north. It's more varied topography. We have more trees. The distances to build up these blowing snow events aren't nearly as big. Where it really gets exciting is when you get to places like Regina, where you have those big, wide open plains. You can actually have a fair bit of snow, but you also have really intense winds. And so a fallow field, for example, or a lentil field, at the end of the year, you're only going to see 23% of your snow actually retain on the landscape. And if you were to have a stubble, maybe you're saving 48%. So these are percentages, but when you're talking about a water-limited environment, an extra 1, 2, 3 inches of moisture, they matter. And just because you have snow doesn't mean it goes in. I will give you that. So that's where, you start to think about your frozen soil processes as well. But generally, the rougher you leave your surface, harrowing makes a difference, stubble types, height is ultimately the main thing. Those will also always give you that increase in potential. That can be appreciable. So this is other work. So if you varied, this is a lot of modeling that went into this, but if you increase your stubble height from 0 to 50 centimeter height, on average with the data set, this is 30 years of data thrown at it, you could see on the order of 50 millimeter increase in average water available to your crops. Saskatoon, less of a response just because we don't have those same kinds of blowing snow and wind events. Stubble is one thing. The other one, which tells you how much you may increase the amount of water on the landscape. The second one is really keeping the water in the landscape. And this is where your soil residues come into play. So if you're able to increase the residue retention on your surface, you will basically disconnect the vapor pressure gradient between your soil and the atmosphere, and you will suppress soil evaporation. That's the long story and a very scientific explanation for if you keep it covered, the water doesn't evaporate nearly as much. The challenge is hydrologic implications of your residue management can be inconsistent. Tillage of a dry field, it doesn't change anything. Tillage of a wet field does. So you have to be cognizant of what your starting point is of your soil moisture, for example, when you start any application. There's a general rule of thumb that for every 5% or for every 10% increase in cover, you might be able to reduce your soil evaporation by 5%. These are small numbers, but they can be incremental. So to put this into context, so we can start tweaking some of these processes, but how much does that actually change things? So this is a bit of a thought exercise that I did during the latter part of my postdoc. But basically, if we're able to increase the amount of snow retained on the landscape from what we observe to the maximum, if we're able to, move from 48% retention to 100%, and build that in with our frozen soil infiltration dynamics, and then also look at if we could decrease our evaporation by increasing our residues by up to 50%, how much water is more available? And so these are, we're on the order of increasing by 20% if you were to able to implement these things. Every year is different, but if our water use efficiency is relatively stable, a 20% increase in water, that's a 20% increase in yield. Just, hypothetical at this point. But the challenge is spatial variability. All of this works if we're looking at a point, but when we get into real world, this is 2023, just south of the Saskatoon here. Every part of the field is different. So we got to be careful with how to do it. And how do we interpret that? So this is where my Croptimistic hat comes on. And it's like, how do we go about doing this? Because we know that this is not a uniform field. There are differences in soil properties. There's differences in our agronomy that's being applied. Are we variable rating nutrients? There's a lot that goes into this. So one of the things that we're working on is, say, looking at, well, let's start mapping out where this water is. And so this is this last year at a site just north of Saskatoon. Topography is very much exaggerated on it. And what you can see is that, we can talk about field averages, but consistently our higher points in the landscape, they have less water holding capacity. They're always going to be dry. But we had parts of the year where we had saturation issues. We also had at the same time water shortage. So how do we balance these things? And that's where we need to think about how we look at our spatial landscape. And yeah, with that, I'll just kind of say these are the key takeaways, and I'll just stop it there.
We'll talk about those takeaways in the Q&A, Phillip. That slide wasn't up there long enough. All right, our last presenter before the Q&A, Kara Annand. Kara is an agrologist and an owner, I think, Kara, right, of Agro Consulting. And Kara will discuss challenges to productivity and profitability. The theme, please help me in welcoming Kara.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me, Jay, and thanks, Warren, for inviting me. There we get going. All right. As Jay said, my name's Annand. I'm the owner of Agro Consulting. I've been an in-field agronomist, boots on in the field for over 20 years. I grew up in Moose Jaw, moved up to Nipawin probably about 22 years ago. My husband and I farm up there with our 3 kids. And this is a picture of my team. And I wanted to bring that up today because I can't do without what I do without my team and all of our growers up there. So we absolutely love working with them, helping them in the field. And we really strive to be on top of all the latest research and progressively helping our growers grow their best crop. So I feel our role as an agronomist has never been as important today as it has just with farms continuing to grow in size and new generations joining the farm. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the small things you can do to gain some big results or make each acre more profitable on your farm. So trying to point out some of the little cost-effective things that you can do as an agronomist or as a farmer. And just doing those little basic things right can be highly productive. Our team is a bottoms-up approach. I see my diagram here is a little scrambled, but today I'm going to talk a little about looking at your seed system and fertility, plant stand establishment, early weed removal, fungicides, looking at insects, and then pre-harvest desiccation as well. So the first thing that our team really talks about is seed system and fertility. So we just came off of a really busy fall of soil sampling. Soil sampling is a very effective tool to give you a pile of information with really a small investment. I always say to anybody who asks me, is soil sampling a good idea, Kara? And I say, well, absolutely. Why wouldn't you go in eyes wide open with as much information as you can have, spending a couple dollars an acre on a $200 fertility investment just makes sense. So when new customers come to us, we sometimes see them overspending on fertility, especially on nitrogen. Another thing we like to talk about with our growers when growing canola is field selection and weed control. Some important questions that I usually ask to my growers do you have resistant weeds on your farm? What's your field history? What's your crop rotation like? Up in the Northeast, we got lots of alfalfa, clover fields. Is it being underseeded? We know it's really easy to run one system on your farm, but that's seldom the right solution. Next thing that we look at lots of times is plant stand establishment. So understanding the seed mortality across your farm is really simple. And other than just taking some time to go out there and do those plant counts, it's really another way you can make your canola acre more profitable. So at Agro, we know we generate the best yields when we can hit that 6 to 7 plants per square foot. And it's really a huge indicator early on to help us predict yields. So knowing your mortality on your farm or for your agronomists is really something that you need to know. And if you don't know it, spend some time and figure that out. As we all know, canola seed is very expensive, and little tweaks can turn into big things. So what are some things that can help you get there? Trash management, that's one thing we always look at after you've combined in the fall. Are you going out there and harrowing? Are you leaving it be? Are you doing something in the spring to make that seed bed nice? Seeding date, I find that a tough one. I would say ideally I'd love for growers to seed in that May 12th to 20th range. Farmers are not patient. We sometimes are having to hold everybody back, but we know there can be those frosts early that can cause some mortality. Seeding speed, another thing that's a really easy, cost-effective thing, just to slow down that 1 mile an hour, get your seed in the proper spot, can also make sure you have a really good plant stand. And then the last thing, just putting where that fertilizer is placed. Is it with the seed? Is it in the mid-row? Where is it going? There's plenty of trial work being done to help make those decisions on your farm. Early weed removal. Start with a clean field, right? The pre-seed options are really usually cheaper than anything you can do in your crop. And they can maybe give you some options to attack weeds that you may not be able to get with the current in-crop options. But we know herbicide resistance is a huge concern, and we got to be aware of the weeds that we have. So no matter what herbicide tolerant system we grow, we know we have to spray. So why not be early? I think one of the first things I learned as an agronomist in my early summers was, you know, those wild oats that are coming out, they're taking away your yield, they're taking away your moisture, your fertility. So why wouldn't we help our crop out, spray early, get ahead of the wild oats, the patches of kochia, and just make sure we can get advanced there on that. Fungicide. So we've seen many of our growers in the south. I grew up in Moose Jaw, like I said, up in Nipawin now, but seen many of our growers in the south growing lentils, canola, durum in these really tight rotations. And weather and conditions are always a question mark. I think when it comes to that fungicide decision, it's always a tough one every year. So I always like to try to use the tools that we have. And one tool we've really been focusing on is using a sclerotinia test. It's really cost effective, and it can help you make some of those critical decisions around whether or not a fungicide is required, along with obviously looking at your rotation and what the weather gave you and what's coming ahead. Insect pressure. This is something as an agronomist, especially in northeast Saskatchewan, I think almost every insect in canola that there is. So flea beetles to start off with, cutworms, diamondbacks, Lagus, Berthas, just to name a few. Sometimes we don't reach the threshold of any of these one pests in particular. But I always think to myself, I can't help but think, is that one of our limits to profitability in canola? Is that maybe the combination or the culmination of all of these together is taking away some of our profits out there? And most of the canola varieties coming to market here are now aimed to be straight cut. As farmers lean away from swathing, we're looking at ways to quickly bring that crop to the bin. So I know just like in spring, patience is also lacking in the fall, and growers are looking for a way to get their crop in the bin quicker. So this past year especially, I've seen some really great successes using a desiccant. Glyphosate's a really good option for those Liberty Link or Clearfield systems. However, dicot can be a really good option for all the systems. So I would say make sure you're really patient with your desiccation or your pre-harvest application. And this means waiting till your crop is done. So let it make those last few bushels. I think there's some free money to be made there. So in summary, I'm pretty certain today I probably haven't told you a whole pile of new information, but I do hope I've reminded you or pointed out some of the basic things that you can do to maximize your productivity on your canola acre. Like I said, managing your investment on your fertilizer, soil test. I think it's a big win for everybody. Managing that weed control, spraying early, knowing what weeds you have, knowing your field when you're going to place canola on there and what your best options are. Managing disease on your farm, using the tools that are available to help you make those decisions. Like I said, whether it's a sclerotinia test, having your agronomist out there, all those things to help make that decision a little bit easier. Manage your insects. That's always a tough one, but if you do need to spray, when is the best time to go after them, and what the ones are that are causing the most grief. And managing your timing on desiccation, right? What's the best solution to help get that crop to the bin as quick as you can, but keep also the most bushels you have. So I'm not sure there's any rocket science here, but sometimes these are the things we truly forget, and I just wanted to pass that info on to you today. So Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the Canola Council, and Warren and Jay. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Gary, you can take a seat. I'll bring you the mic. All right, all 4 of you can come up. There are mics here, so we'll grab those. Got mic 4. Oh, we have 19 minutes for a Q&A, and I've jotted down a few questions, but maybe Keith will go straight to you. Is there one that you want to? Oh, did you lose your mic? Yeah, we took all the mics.
Sure, you give me a job, Jay, and then no way to talk. I could go without a mic, but you're not allowed to do that here. Actually, the one that's been upvoted the most is for Ian, so I get to pick on a coworker. Ian, is there potential for blackleg resistance information for varieties being released across the board so farmers can choose varieties off blackleg testing results in the field?
Right, so for those familiar, we do have some varieties we do have a working group working on this, and some varieties are labeling their resistance genes and going through, but not everyone. That would be a goal for us. That's a long-term plan. It's not as simple with different types of resistance genes, the major and minor, and getting that. The system is not exactly a perfect system, but absolutely that is the goal, and we are, again, working with the industry trying to move that forward, because that, again, with blackleg issues like this, knowing what you've had in the past, being able to test for that race and then pick is an excellent tool. There's other tools. The nice thing with blackleg is we do have a variety of management tools, but that's a really critical one. That's one where, based on last year, or you can go back and if you're on a 2-year rotation, you can go get stubble from last canola crop, bring it to the lab, and now for this next spring, you can figure out or have a better chance of figuring out what variety is going to work well in your field, right? They're all rated varieties, but not necessarily in your specific field. So yeah, absolutely, a big goal of council.
Keith, do you want to keep going? I've got a few here, but maybe we'll make sure the crowd is involved. And anyone, if you don't want to use Slido, there's a mic there, and Keith can also hand off his mic for this end of the room. Go ahead, Keith.
So probably a question to keep you talking, at least, is what are the research gaps we need to fill in order to advance your work or make your projects better?
Good broad question. We'll start with you, Dan. Research gaps?
Yeah, okay. I think, one of the big issues that we have is that, speaking about this 4R BMPs and nitrous oxide reduction, is we have there's a couple of BMPs that are pretty hard to get at, and variable rate is one of them. And then one of the other ones is section control. And those might have some real potential to both improve, nitrogen use efficiency in the field and to reduce the nitrous oxide. But we know very little about how they behave out in the field. And it's somewhat difficult research. It's part of the reason it hasn't been done. But that I would say, would be one of the big research gaps that we're currently looking at, is expanding that toolbox for nitrous oxide management.
Dan, just while you're talking, were there, I was just thinking, your presentation had a lot of kind of, downward sloping profitability projections. Were there 4R practices that, on their own showed a clear ROI for farmers?
Well, on their own, the only one we found was that fall to spring. And, but I think it's in every, as was said several times, every farm is different and every farm situation is different, and production varies widely from year to year and place to place and that. But I think the thing with the 4R practices and fertility management is that you need to, you need to combine it with those yield increases. And it wasn't really the 4R, the 4R practices for nitrogen management cost some money, But it's also, without that yield increase, there's just this relentless downward pressure on the margin because of, all the other costs that are coming up. And then farmers have to deal with, the volatility in crop prices and that. So, yes, are some. One of the ones we didn't show up there that we did some work on was section control. That was a pretty, and, I've seen that played out with some of the farmers I was working with a few years ago, that they switched to section control, and some of them were in those landscapes where there was a lot of obstacles, and, it paid back pretty quickly.
Yeah. So, I agree. That does sound good, Dan. Phillip, research gaps?
How much time do we have? I guess there's kind of two things that come to mind, and I'll just pick up with Dan. Maybe I didn't talk about it much in my presentation, but, variable rate. Like, I'm clearly wearing this shirt right now, so I have this interest in variable rate. But, we don't have good models, data out there to actually, come up with a good answer to, is this an effective practice or not? And that's just an area that needs more work. It's hard. I guess the other kind of hat that I'll wear is like the hydrology hat. And, there's a lot of work that's done. There's a lot of studies in field and all that. But there's a lot of nuance that sometimes we can lose when we're looking at a study and we've got our two control variables and this is our treatment, when, what we're seeing is an environmental response. And so, that requires, we need to have, we need to put snow into our equations. It's not fun, but we need to have, we need more context to a lot of these results for a lot of these things.
Phillip, just while you're talking, one of the notes I took down was your point about the graph showing canola relatively low water use efficiency compared to some other crops. Is that something is that a genetic solution, or is there an agronomy solution that could help water use efficiency?
Well, when you're comparing that, what that's coming down to is the low harvest index on a canola, right? It's about quarter versus a lentil is like half, So, I'm not a plant breeder, but, can we lower a harvest index on a canola?
Actually, that came up last night at supper. So the harvest index is the ratio of harvested seed to the biomass that's left over.
Yeah, the above ground. How much of that plant are you actually taking off the field? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right, Kara, to you. Research gaps, and again, could be a long list for you, but what are some of the things that you'd really like to get solved in the next few years, if possible?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I think kind of going back to my presentation there, something we struggle at as an agronomist is on that insect side of things. And typically in July, we're dealing with diamondbacks. We're dealing with, maybe I've got 100 diamondbacks. I've got 3 ligas and my sweep net, and then I've got some berthas that are coming through. And not one of those insects is at threshold, but each one's taking their little bit of that crop, right? And I always struggle where to pull the pin or if to pull the pin. The data says don't pull the pin on things, but my gut says we're losing and everything's taking its little bit, right? So I'd sure like to see some work done on that respect. And I know really insect work is hard, but I do have some fields in Northeast Sask I can point you to. So.
And do you, at this point in your career, do you feel like your gut is a pretty trustworthy organ?
I think that's a tough one. I think some days, yes. It's always then having that conversation, I think, with the grower, right? And I think the nice thing about having that good relationship and being out in the field at least once a week, if not more often, and just communicating that back and forth gives a really good indication between myself and the grower on whether or not we should or not pull the pin on having to deal with that insect, because there is tons of beneficials out there too, right? So I want to make sure that answer is made
the
smartly.
beneficials are important. Good point.
Absolutely.
I'm not letting you off the hook yet. Ian, I'll get to you. But Kara, you mentioned the sclerotinia test as being one of the key parts of your agronomy approach. Which test do you use? And why? Why did you pick that one?
We started off using the test there, and I think that was a very good test. We've switched.
The pedal test?
The pedal test, yeah, and then moved over using quantums right now, and just giving us one more tool out there, right, to where it's an expensive decision that growers have to make, and we just really want to have as much information gathered as possible. So if it can help us kind of solidify along with like weather conditions, knowing that field, knowing the situation, it's just kind of helping us make that decision a little more solidly.
Well, thanks, Kara. Ian, research needs. And again, I'm sure you have a lot in your head. What's one or two?
Yeah, there's always an endless need, and just when you think you have something around, we have, right now, there's a lot of research going on verticillium, and I have a lot of questions from growers, and we're funding basic science. You need the basic science before we have BMPs, but, that's just the life of research cycle. Based on what I was talking about today, I think I like the idea of pulling it together. There's a lot of research that's been done in canola, and we've covered a lot of gaps. If we talk about fertility, we talk about blackleg. We have a yield loss model. We can tell you based on the amount of blackleg we're seeing in your field, how many bushels we're losing. And that's some of the analysis I was working here, was pulling those things together. So we know blackleg. We have stand establishment. We know that from Julia Leeson's work, I think 90% of fields have areas with less plant stand than that's ideal. We're losing yield there. It's a matter of pulling these things together. I think as you heard from a couple people here, these things cascade through the growing season. You lose some of your plant stand to flea beetles and cutworms. You're now managing that through weed control. What does that do to our critical period of weed control? Will we be applying earlier? Probably, but again, what does that do then for the next stage? And what's the next thing? And we get that's sometimes where the research is lacking, where we have individual studies that look really good, where they've done a great job of doing the research, where they've controlled all the variables except for the one we're looking at. But in the field, quite often we see multiple of these things happening. So that's where that yield enhancement project that we had a little bit of a primer on this morning. Given the hand that you're dealt and the evolving hand, how do we manage it? How do we say, I was 90% effective at using the water is available, maybe I added some water, or I was, how effective am I doing that in my field, and knowing that every field is a little different. How do I manage my yield robbers? I think that's kind of a broader one and not an easy one, but some sort of project looking at canola and how in the conditions we're dealt, how did we do that? How do we manage all of those things together? I think not an easy one, but I think one that would really push us forward as an industry.
I'm not going to ask this question now because we're going to the floor, but before we close, each of you is going to get a minute to do your key takeaway, because we kind of skimmed through those at the end. Question?
Yeah, a question more for Phillip in regards to water use efficiency. I'm just curious about the effect of row spacing and water use efficiency. Like, does narrow row spacing prevent evaporation and increase transpiration? Or, yeah, just your thoughts on that.
It depends. It's hard to say that with a lot of confidence. I haven't done that work myself, but water use efficiency is often this tool of like, can we evaluate the implications of this practice from that perspective? And off the top of my head, I think there were some studies that I've read that do look at that. And in theory, yes, you will, have a more closed canopy technically. That will reduce your soil evaporation and will therefore make more water available for transpiration. So in theory, yes, but it's one lever within how many others that probably may overwhelm that response. It's not going to be a huge response. It's not going to be the game-changing part.
Thank you.
Phillip, just on transpiration, were you talking about transpiration of water within the soil or within the plant?
Transpiration from the plant, evaporation from the soil.
Okay. Yeah, because one of the things that came up yesterday in the smoke discussion was, when the stomata close in response to that dry scenario, you lose transpiration, and that just stops water flow, or more or less, through the plant. Have I got that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Keith, one more from you, and then I'm going to go to my key takeaway.
Well, I'm not sure if this is the right question, Jay, but you got to listen to the people. And this is for over coffee. Whoever asked this question has to come forward and catch your local agronomist. I have a neighbor who's still summer following. Can Canola Council send someone out to talk to him? So that's not really addressed at the panel. But for Kara, so yes, over coffee, find your agronomist or come talk to me. We'll chat about summer follow, and we can even send somebody out if it's important to you. For Kara, there was one in here about how do you recommend customers set yield targets and crop budgets?
That's a good question. I think it starts Well, what we do, I guess, with our growers, we sit down with them in the winter, make a solid plan, talk about what their budget is for that field, I guess. It's a lot different talking with a grower if we're talking about 40 bushel canola or 30 bushel canola and in some of our drier parts versus talking with some of our really super progressive guys that are aiming for the moon at 80 bushels, right? So just having that good conversation, understanding, knowing their limitations on their farm, knowing where their land is, and just kind of having that really strong background and that relationship with them, I think gives you the idea and the plan to make those recommendations with them going forward.
Kara, I know you're biased, obviously, but speaking of research gaps, is there any research that shows that a farmer with using an agronomist gets X yield and a farmer who doesn't gets this? I'm just wondering if you could make this is your chance to do a business pitch here.
Well, I think my take home here, and I'm going to cut into my own thing, is it's just understanding and having that relationship and knowing the farm. I always say my sales pitch is if I can't make you the money back that it's costing me or that I'm charging you, that I'm not doing a very good job as an agronomist. And hopefully we can make that in the first week back, right? But it's just small things, right? Understanding just the little details that maybe is just getting missed or whatever. But I really think having eyes in the field on a weekly basis is just, that I always say, I know there's wild oats in this field, I knew this, but it allows me to open up my eyes to see other things that I would normally miss because I can be there so often and have that relationship, so.
Right on. Thanks for parlaying that into your takeaway. Perfect. Thanks, Kara. We'll go down the line. Dan, takeaway?
Yeah, I think the main thing I hope you came away with is that, that this whole sustainable ag, and especially around greenhouse gas emissions, that there's a cost with it. It can be fairly substantial. And, when you're out, every farm and every farmer is going to have to work their own way through that maze. And so, it's really a lot about understanding, where your nitrogen program is at. Are you over applying, under applying? Do you have yield potential you're leaving on the table? Some of the things that the other, that Ian came up with and Carla. There's lots of opportunity to push that yield up and improve that nitrogen use efficiency, but you really have to think it through, and especially the costing part of it before you decide what you're going to improve in terms of BMPs on the farm. So,
thanks, Dan. Phillip?
Yeah, I guess kind of the overall takeaway is, I spend a lot of time thinking about environmental aspects, the water component of things. And I guess the takeaway being that, anytime someone goes onto their field, they are doing some sort of agricultural water management. And sometimes that's not fully appreciated. It may not seem like much. It's going to come back maybe later on. But there's a lot of hydrology that's going on within the growing season and throughout the non-growing seasons that do make a difference. And, being aware of the implications of what you're doing when you head onto the field with your, whatever piece of equipment, you potentially have the ability to tweak a lot of your crop available water, but it's hard to see that. So just, being aware of some of those feedbacks that are invisible.
And just to emphasize, I think your key points that you put through were if you're in an area that is typically short of water, stubble and residue on the surface.
Yes.
Yeah.
Water's a double-edged sword. Sometimes you want it, sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
But you can use that lever to go both ways. You want more water, increase your stubble. You want less, decrease your stubble. Same kind of thing with the residues.
Good. Thanks, Phillip. All right, Ian. Last word to you.
Oh, the worst, the last word. Key takeaways. We talk about agronomy. We have a fertility session, and then we have a pathology session. These are excellent. But as growers probably know this best, pulling all those pieces together, and you can do 3 of the 4 things right, or 9 out of the 10 things right. And as we push yields and as we push profitability, sometimes management gets more complex. again, if we do 9 out of 10 things right, but that last thing costs us, that's the one that costs us the most yield. Those other parts, it's really hard to, suddenly they're not cost effective. We are pushing, if we're going to push our fertility rate, we have to do all these other cascading steps. And really, I think sometimes we gloss over those, how it all has to tie together in a neat agronomic package, and how that then, maybe something else comes in, the environment comes in. But again, it's cost, and at the end of the day, if one of those things goes wrong, the grower is the one left on the hook with the profitability that maybe doesn't kind of come to fruition. So the idea of pulling this together and looking at it a little bit more holistically of pulling those together, and that's really hard from a research standpoint, but I think that's critical if we want growers to adopt some of these management practices, or if we look at some of management practices that are solid science but maybe lack some of the adoption. Sometimes it's the logistics, or it's the broader happening on the farm in the busy season, why we don't see the adoption, why some of them are really quite quickly adopted.
Well, thanks to the 4 of you. I'm going to check my notes to make sure there's something I need to say, but we're heading into a break.
Right. Afternoon coffee break. Remember to check out the posters while you're in the room next door, and we'll see you back here at 3 for our last session of the day. Thank you.
I was gonna.
On time, on schedule? Seems to go okay? No.